So, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin this concert the way every Cowboy Band concert begins. Please stand and remove cover as the band plays our national anthem, followed by the Kansas State song and Home on the Range. A newspaper reporter in 1884 once asked the leader of the Cowboy Band, why do you swing that 6-shooter for? To which he replied, it's my baton. Is it loaded? Yes. What for? To shoot the first man that strikes a false note. We here in Dodge City are pretty partial to the Old West, and this next tune by the band salutes that wonderful heritage. This piece features 3 gallant tunes from great Western movies. It features the Magnificent Seven, where 7 title characters are hired to protect a small Mexican village from marauding bandits. How the West Was Won, one of Hollywood's greatest epics depicting the West, as it was won by pioneers, settlers, and adventurers, and Silverado, where 4 men bring peace and equality to the city of Silverado. Here is the Wild Westerns. the age of 19, he began playing baritone in various circus bands. His first full-time conducting job was in 1914 with the combined Sells Floto Circus and Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. He eventually became bandmaster of the Barnum and Bailey Circus Band in 1917. In 1920, he became the conductor for the Fort Dodge, Iowa Municipal Band, a position that he held for 51 years. The next march from the Cowboy Band is entitled Rough Riders and pays tribute to both President Theodore Roosevelt and the volunteer cavalrymen who became known as the Rough Riders. Here is a great gallop march, Rough Riders. The commission was funded in part by a donation from Randy Allen in honor of his parents. The title of this piece derives from a newspaper article in the Fort County Globe dated July 18, 1882. The article says, Alderman C.M. Beeson, or rather Chalk as we all know him, after years of trials, has at last succeeded in organizing a brass band, and we claim it the Band of the Land, of which Dodge City justly may be proud. This Western-style overture piece was premiered last summer. Here's the Dodge City Cowboy Band with Band of the Land. harmonies unfold beautifully and the emotional peak is attained through a gradual building up of the instrumentation. Let's enjoy Nightsong. Displaying its many moods, from serene to tumultuous to heralding grandeur. Folks, here is the North Face. players and audiences alike, one of Carl King's finest. Here is Lexington March. Celebrated its 200th anniversary. The various sections of this next piece highlight areas of the trail, including Cimarron Cutoff, Mountain Vistas, Buffalo Bill, and Pikes Peak. Ladies and gentlemen, the Dodge City Cowboy Band with Along the Santa Fe Trail. Brian Ballinger's composition. According to Mr. Ballinger's notes, the idea for this piece came from a single set of watercolors. When children get a hold of these and use their imagination, the most amazing things can happen. Children can see things that adults never see. They open our minds while we help them grow and learn. With a little imagination, these watercolors can become a magnificent sunrise or sunset over the ocean, a gorgeous view from the mountaintop, or an image of a supernova in space. Let's see what a little color and water can do with rippling watercolors.
Longbranch variety show. The show originally started as a special event for the opening weekend of the Front Street Replica on July 4th, 1958, and played in the Longbranch Saloon for 62 summers. It was moved outdoors for 2020 and for 2 years was presented in the Mariah Gallery before moving to this space in 2023. So the Cowboy Band's next piece is a song from the Longbranch Variety Show that dates back to 1958. Written by Rosemary Mock, down at the Longbranch Saloon is a saloon tradition, and it's still part of the show today. If you know the words, sing along. Bang, bang, boom, boom, smoke filled the room, down at the Longbranch Saloon. The different sections of this overture paint a picture of what it is like to hike among the massive boulders and rocky trails in broad daylight, or even enjoy the mesmerizing change of colors at sunset on the uniquely colored landscape. Here is Red Rock Canyon.
Fridays